Hello, welcome to this episode of What the Block, and today we're talking about stateBlock, which is basically a cornerstone of interactivity in DGLogik 5. So stateBlock can be found in, of course, data flow block list right here. In addition, it appears automatically when you record a behavior for any component. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to create a simple circle, and I'm going to go to actions, add an action, set state, and I'm going to say record, right? And I can change the background color, for example, or fill color of this. Finish recording. And if we take a look at the data flow of that shape, you see that stateBlock has been created with one option in there affecting the fill of the object. Okay, so basically there are two ways to get a stateBlock onto your data flow. One is to manually grab it from a list of the blocks, and the other one, of course, is just to record an action, add an action from the actions list and record it. Okay, so we'll get back to recording a little bit later. Let's go ahead and explore all the options we have in clear stateBlock. So basically, stateBlock as it looks when you first drag it out with nothing in there. So you always have two triggers, invoke and revert. Invoke, of course, will execute whatever actions you define on this stateBlock, and revert will execute basically the revert actions. We'll look at them in 1 second here. Enable, of course, will turn it on and off. When disabled, any triggering of these properties is ignored, of course, and the block will not run. Now, duration will allow you to animate state change, assuming the state change is numeric. Duration will control how long the animation would last in milliseconds. And of course, you have two output events on finished and on reverted. So these will get triggered automatically when stateBlock is finished with all its tasks. So you can use it to trigger something else in your logic when actions are completed by this stateBlock. And on reverted, of course, it does the same thing when all the actions have been reverted, meaning that revert trigger has been hit and all the actions have been executed. Okay, group property is something slightly different. We'll get back to it again a little bit later in this episode. So for now, let's take a look at how to add an action or add a property to the stateBlock. We're going to hit a plus button, right? And we get an empty path here, which is expecting a path to a component property that we're trying to affect. So here you can, of course, type it in if you're good with kind of manual pathing, but pretty much nobody is. So it's much easier to just drag a property that you're trying to affect. So let me go ahead and create our guinea pig here, which is just a square in this case. And I'm going to drag the fill right onto my path. When I let go, you will notice that it did not bind. It actually populated the path to that property. At parent, that shape, that background. So parent. So keep in mind, I'm on the stage now. So basically, at parent means it's getting out of the stateBlock, going to the stage, then dot shape. So shape object, and then dot background, the background property of the shape object. Right. So you have to click outside of the block and then back in, so it can update the editor. So you can see now. The change property has gained a color editor because we're affecting the fill property. So you have the fill selector here. So here we can select what we want to change this property to, right? So if I change this to red, right? So what I'm essentially saying is when this stateBlock is executed, it should go and set the property of this path, which is this property here, to color red. So now it's time to take a look at revert, right? So how do you define a revert state? Basically, go back state. So if you click on this little I kind of information button, you will notice, or I guess that's exclamation point, you will notice a few more options. Namely, you have the option called original. So this is what you define as your revert state. If you leave it null, meaning this dot is not filled, so you've never picked a value here, what this would mean is every time it reverted, it will revert to whatever the value the property had before you executed the invoke. To demonstrate, so let me first, well, let's keep it green, right? So I'm going to go ahead and invoke this, right? You notice this became red. So I'm going to revert this, and it became green again. Now, if I'm going to go ahead and make it blue and invoke, right? It's red now. When I revert, it's blue, right? So it's not reverting to any particular state. It's reverting to whatever state that was present before it was invoked. However, if you actually specify a value in the original, let's make it yellow, right? Now this block, so on invoke, of course, we'll make it red. On revert, it will always set the revert state, which is now permanently yellow, right? So regardless of what the state may happen to be set to outside of this state block, right? Revert will still make it yellow, right? So just to reiterate, if you want to revert to the state, whatever value was there prior to the invocation, you have to keep it as null. So you have to reset this. Right? If you have a specific value that you want to revert to, then you go ahead and set it in your original editor here. Right, and a few more options there. Control easing and strength of the animation. So if you're affecting a numeric property, this will control kind of easing effects, right? So it's linear by default, but you can do ease in, elastic, and bounce, and all kinds of stuff. You can experiment yourself. It's pretty fun. So this is especially interesting when you affect position of something. So let's go ahead and demonstrate this. So we're going to add, in addition to the color cannot really be animated effectively. So let's animate the X position of the square, which is here. All right, so we're going to be affecting this. All right, so now let's set it to 500. So that means we're going to move it to 500 pixels from the left edge. And of course, our original will set it to 50. Easing, let's do bounce. Right, and you can specify a different effect on revert, or if you leave it as is, it'll just use the same effect as on the invoke. And then, of course, the duration of the animation. So let's do 1 second. Right, so notice, and by the way, I did make a mistake. So this is in seconds, not milliseconds. So if you need a short animation, you have to do decimals, so 0.2 seconds. And so that's almost invisible. So let's do 0.6. Revert. All right. You get the idea. All right. So that covers the essential function of a state block, affecting properties. Now let's look at one very important aspect of this. This is called serialization. So in this extra menu here for each of the affecting properties, there's a property called disableSerialization. So when it's false, it means serialization is enabled. It's enabled by default. So what this means is that any property that this state block affects, right, whatever values it writes, they get serialized into the page, which means if I go and save this page now and then reopen it, then the values that the block set will remain in the page. So let me demonstrate. I'm going to set this to 300. Right, and I'm going to go ahead and save this page. So I'm going to save as. State block, okay. Like this. So if I'm going to close and reopen now, and look into my square, my shape, right? So this is 300. Now I'm going to execute the block, which will set it to 500. Right, I'm going to save the page again, Control S, close it. Right, reopen it again. Right, and if I look at my left coordinate, it's 500. Right, so the value that stateBlock has set to this property got serialized into the page and got saved with the page. Now, however, if I disable that, so if I enable the disable serialization property, so basically I'm turning serialization off, right? Now look what's going to happen now. I'm going to set it to, let's say, 700. Right, I'm going to execute, right? So now it's 700. I'm going to save the page, reopen this. And if we look at our x coordinate, it's still 500, right? It's the value that was serialized prior to that, but it didn't serialize 700. So why is this important? Well, as you develop a page, right, you'll be inevitably executing change state blocks left and right, basically, as page interacts with you, as you build new interactions. So if it's important to you that the page loads in a specific state, that your variables have specific values, your objects have specific positions, when page first opens, and then if you didn't have ability to disable serialization on these blocks, that means every time you work with a page and blocks fire and change things around, you have to manually go back and reset all these property values that were affected back to their original positions to save the page, right? And only then can you save the page. Now, if you disable serialization on your state blocks, basically right away as you create them, that means you can interact with the page all you want, but when you go to save it, right, all these values that were written by your state blocks, none of them will get serialized with the page. They will all still retain the original values that you typed in there when you first created them. And that's extremely helpful, right? You can use this in project data flow as well. Again, when you're trying to set up an initial state of your application, it's important that your state blocks don't keep changing that on you, right? And you don't keep saving the new values unintentionally. So I would say in about 99% of situations, you would want to disable serialization. It's very rare when that you want to actually not disable it and have those blocks serialized values, because typically you're not going to find saving the page feature by in the page itself. So there's no reason for anything to get serialized in there when it comes to state blocks. Okay, so hopefully that was clear. And now the final portion of this is group. Now group is a little bit oddball feature. It was added for a specific purpose to ease creating object states, meaning that if you're creating a widget that you want to have several states, and state may affect kind of multiple blocks, multiple state blocks, and multiple properties. For example, change the whole theme of your widget from light to dark, and so on. Right, to avoid extra labor by recording a bunch of these state blocks. So there's a function called group. So when two blocks have the same group, so here I'm going to create two state blocks, and I'm going to make this group AA and this one as well. And I'm going to go ahead and record it. So I'm going to go to my actions. All right. So these state blocks show up here, just like this. And I'm going to record one of them. Right. Keep in mind, this only works when you record it. If you manually add the properties and you specify what you want to affect, it has no effect. It only has effect when you're actually physically recording. So let's say I'm going to make this shape fill, change it to blue, and finish recording. Notice that both of them gained the same action, but one of them is basically setting it back to red. So this is very similar to the revert feature, right? But remember, for the revert feature, unless you manually set the revert value, we'll just revert whatever the value is prior to invocation. This automatically sets the value for a for a initial state, right? So state one is now blue, right? State zero is red because that's what it was, before I changed it to blue. So basically, pairing them with group setting just allows you to record kind of two blocks at once. One being basically a revert block, except being a separate block rather than a revert feature of the same block. Again, it's a fairly narrow use case, but I don't want to leave properties untouched here. I want to tell you about every single property that we've got here. So I think that's about wraps it up for the state block. This episode ran a bit longer than usual because this block is, it's pretty essential to just about everything you do in DGLogik 5. So hopefully I made it clear for you and gave you some more insights on how to use this better and more efficiently in your applications. Until next time, I'm Paul Sinenko.